The Mennonite Heritage Village and Museum in Steinbach is celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2014, a half-century spent preserving and presenting the experience and history of the Russian Mennonites in southeastern Manitoba. Local filmmaker Laszlo Marcovics emigrated to Steinbach from Hungary 6 years ago and took an immediate interest in the city's history and the Mennonite families who originally settled here back in the late 1870s. He recently completed a documentary that chronicles the lives of Steinbach's earliest residents, as well as the history of one of Steinbach's earliest established businesses.
The story has two lines parallelly. One is the story of the Mennonites, how they got here, what happened in Russia before the 1874 year when they settled here, and the other story is just the family story of this shop.
Abraham Friesen was the one who founded Friesen Machine, and in those days it was called Friesen Machine Shop. And when my dad took over, they changed it to Friesen Machine Works.
I always saw this little shop on Friesen, this machine shop, Friesen Machine Shop, and I saw the little tag on the building that it's a heritage building. So one day I just said, okay, why not? Let's talk to the guy. So I knocked on the door. I met Pete Friesen, who is the owner, and it happened to be that they have owned the business since the 1890s. Same location, the area belonged to his family, and the great-grandfather of Pete was Abraham S. Friesen, who was one of the very first settlers here from Russia. So it just became such a nice round story, and the shop has very old machines from the 1950s, 60s, even some from the earlier times. So the environment just immediately was striking that you could make great pictures in the shop.
In the early years, they worked on steam engines, rebuilding them, all the rivets around the boilers. They did that, and they made wagon wheels. Upstairs was a woodworking shop, and downstairs was the blacksmith shop. And they hammered the metal out and made the wheels in there. And I'm sure they did a whole lot of other things too.
I think the first 20, 30 years, they just spent doing the same thing what they did in Russia. Even there is an interesting story in the film that one guy just wanted to build springs into the carts he was making, and the Mennonite community said at the time that it's just too much of a luxury, so he was not allowed to do that.
My great-grandfather, Abraham S. Friesen, owned a treadmill, and so for the grinding of grain, and his brother-in-law, Klaus Reimer, owned a blacksmith shop. So these are ways of supporting agriculture, but they're not directly agriculture, and they're starting to move into another area of activity that is kind of by the, so the church held this in a little bit of, with some caution. That is, they saw the potential of worldly pride in these activities. And so when Klaus Reimer built wagons with springs, he was reprimanded because this was not seen as necessary to have the luxury of springs in the wagons, and a potential departure from the basic teaching of simplicity.
I think from the 1920s, 30s, it started changing, and I think the reason is because car manufacturers started selling more and more cars. So obviously, for better traveling and shortening the time to travel to Winnipeg, it was necessary to pick up the travel by car. So I think the first one was a Ford dealership in Steinbach. Actually, in the same place they opened this dealership, so on the Friesen and Main.
Although he is generations apart from those who had the courage and determination to leave all they knew behind them in Russia for the dream of a new life in Canada, Marcovics still feels a connection between the stories of the Mennonite settlers and his own desire for a better life in Steinbach.
I grew up in a very lucky family. I was 21 when my great-grandfather died. So basically I could see 5 or 6 generations of my whole family. So in this way I consider myself lucky. And what was really interesting to move here to Canada and go to the Heritage Village to see the museum. Basically they have the same artifacts here, household artifacts and tools here what my great-grandfather used to have. I used to play with those stuff in his house, and around his house he had a small garden and vineyard and everything else, so he had the tools. I felt the connection, and of course my situation was much better than the Mennonites' situation in Russia at the time, but I'm here in Canada, so I emigrated as well.
Men Made It, Men Can Fix It is being shown at the Mennonite Heritage Village and Museum as part of the museum's 50th anniversary film night. Marcovics hopes that those who come out to watch the film will take away a lot more than just a lesson on the history of Steinbach.
I think they should get more of the feeling of a community. Maybe they should feel closer towards each other, and having more about this common Mennonite background and the history. They probably would value more that lifestyle, because even in the last 6 years we've been here, I've seen such a huge and drastic change even in Steinbach. So it's going away. So probably it's a kind of way of preserving these storylines. In 20, 40 years, those guys won't be alive anymore. So nobody will tell these stories. So I think this way we just could preserve a piece of a little history here in Steinbach.
For Steinbach Online, I'm Karen Black.